Good afternoon, everybody. Dick Kittner here at Washington and Lee University. Welcome to the FLAVA workshop. This afternoon we have Dr. Sharon Hahnlen, who's from Liberty University, who is Associate Professor of English and Modern Languages there. And she'll be talking to us about, as you can see on your screen, teaching a lesson with meaningful input strategies. And this is all a part of the TEL project, T2 to Input, that information that goes to our students. As a reminder, very quickly before we do start, we will have a survey which is going to be issued in the latter part of next week, hopefully not a very busy time for you. And you'll be able to complete that survey. And you will have individual questions for each one of the workshops that we have, as well as general questions concerning the whole series in itself. And we'd appreciate you completing that for us. All right, now I'll turn it over to Dr. Hahnlen, who is here, and thank you very much.
Welcome to session 4. These technology hiccups put me right at ease. It's how most of my classes start every day in the classroom. So it seems like in front of you, colleagues and licensure candidates, maybe some graduate assistants, maybe some guests, and so I am going to format this like I would one of my classes, and we'll just go from there. When Dr. Kettner asked me to do this final session on teaching the lesson with meaningful input strategies, I know he gave me all 3 of the standards, that he had probably left me with the one that had the most material that had to be worked out. And so when we met this afternoon, I told him I wasn't sure. I was thankful he had asked me, but it was an interesting time putting it together. The TEL standards, which are related to the Virginia professional standards, do have 3 that deal, I think, particularly with input strategies. As I looked at them, I can relate them to input strategies, and so I've structured this session a little bit like structuring input strategies, and that we're going to start with prior knowledge and background information and kind of spiral down around that into very focused and specific items. So let's go ahead and get started here. Question we have to ask today is, which high-yield strategies help my students achieve the daily performance objectives? And I will remind you that the TEL documents on the TEL project site, and I have the URL in a slide coming up, provide self-evaluation checklists for each of these standards for the teacher. And I like to look at the checklist as a way of quick looking at what I am doing and then using those checklists for reflection on my teaching practices later. What we want by the end of the session is to understand types of input, and for many of us this will be a refresher, to understand characteristics of input, maybe some characteristics we haven't thought about, and to understand how input strategies really highlight all of teaching. I frequently get phone calls from people. Dr. Kettner did say that I teach at Liberty University. Most of you are familiar with our school, and many of our students are interested in using their content areas, not English as a second language. And I will get a phone call from a student, potential student, someone who's already been overseas for a while, and this is how it always starts. Dr. Hahnlen, so-and-so gave me your name. I'm going to be going to such and such a country in 3 weeks to teach English as a second language. What do I need to know to do that? And I don't want to be ungracious to the person, but I do always remind them that they are asking for an entire course over the phone in the next 10 minutes. Really, these input strategies do highlight all of what we do in teaching. The input strategies have to do with our delivery. They have to do with the approach that we're using in the classroom. They have to do with our assessment. They have to do with our own personal understanding of how students receive information, and then our reflection as professionals. So what this session on the 3 standards has turned out to be, for me, is a personal review of how do we teach. The first standard, T2, says, I give my students age-appropriate responsibility for managing their own behavior. And you have here on the screen the URL for the TEL project, where you will find those checklists and a lot of other very good information. This is a little bit of a spiral. It's like most input. It can be adapted for lower age developmentally, lower proficiency levels, higher proficiency levels. The thing I like about thinking about my input strategies is that I can often use the same strategy at the various levels, simply making adaptations for their own understanding, their own background knowledge, and their proficiency development levels. The TEL project documents give you some of the standards that are coordinated with TEL standards. We find similar standards in the ACFEL intake standards, the NTASC, which in my understanding is merging with NCATE, the NBTS standards. I have added, simply for your benefit, but more for my benefit in my classroom when I use the materials again, a few other standards, because in my teaching location, I deal with language acquisition, I deal with methods and materials, I deal with assessment. I teach in the classroom all levels of French, so you will see many of my examples on the slide come from French. My methods and materials class combines not only licensure candidates, but non-licensure candidates in teaching English second language, because these are many of those young people who feel called to use their language abroad, not in the U.S., but frequently come back saying, well, I didn't go, I got married, other things, life happened around me, and now I want to teach. So we require all of our students in that, licensure and non-licensure, to take the same classes. So I have some coordinated TESOL standards. And if you're working with TESOL, you're working with the WIDA standards that many states have adopted for their ESL, and we'll come back to that again later. I've put the Virginia standards for professional practice of all teachers down at the bottom, just copied it down. They don't all say exactly the same thing, but they're all in the same ballpark. And so in T2, we're talking about age-appropriate responsibilities. What do I, as a teacher, have to know in order to allow students to take on responsibility at their age level? Well, first of all, I have to know what the developmental characteristics of those age levels are. I know my undergraduate candidates have to take a course in developmental psychology, but I wonder how many times after they leave that course they really think of the developmental characteristics when they're actually in the classroom. How are these students learning? What does research tell us about how they're learning? That comes out of the developmental psychology. Our teaching approaches also come out of the developmental psychology over the decades. Something we need to be paying a little more attention to, I think, are the generational characteristics, and I'll come back to that on another slide. But what's the difference? Do you have in your adult classes, for example, if you're teaching on the college level, do you have older learners and young people right out of high school? If you do, you have two distinct audiences, because your older learners do not learn in the same way your younger learners do. And some of us who are of the older generation often tend to say, well, I really like my older learners because they're more focused, they get their work done, they're serious. But my younger learners are learning too. They just learn in a different way. So there are the traditionalists, there are baby boomers, there's Generation X, there's Generation Y, and you really should know the basic tenets of those generational characteristics in order to focus on that in your classroom. You need to know classroom management strategies, just general strategies, which will be in play if you have a small class or if you have a large classroom. How are you going to adapt your teaching approach and even the type of input that you want to use to those classes? And then also collaborative and cooperative learning strategies. How can I use collaborative and cooperative learning strategies with my students when I am also using input strategies? I would much rather be using my own computer. Okay, so now I'm going to ask you to come up with some student characteristics. You can focus on developmental characteristics, learning characteristics, generational characteristics, but I'd like to hear what you have to say about student characteristics that will affect their learning and will affect the responsibility that you can give them for their own learning in the classroom. So we'll take maybe 5 minutes. I don't like to spend a lot of time on discussion. If it becomes useless discussion, I will tell you one of my biases right now in my discussion boards with my graduate students. One of my caveats is I don't want to know what you feel. And if I see a response starting with, I feel that, it will be stricken. I want thinking going on. So as long as we're coming up with thinking, that's fine. And when we're not, I'll go on to something else. So 5 minutes discussing student characteristics. All right, we muted the sound on this end so you wouldn't hear our discussions. I'm not going to let my students here in this room get off the hook and not have to discuss. So yes, these are some good responses. Economic, family status, that's particularly important when you're dealing with not only world languages, but I cross the fence world languages and include in that English second language because those are the students I deal with as licensure candidates. And I see that particular issue very prevalent when I see my students working with their ESL students. The difference between seniors in high school and younger students, mid-level classes, different age groups in one class, yes. Big challenge for a teacher, what is relevant to our students. The different motivations, I like this, whether they need it for credit or whether they really want to learn something, or whether, as was suggested here, their parents said they had to take it, whether they've been told that they need the language for a certain career path, may not have checked it out actually. Different age groups in one class. Let's see, what else do we have here? Their attention span, yes, which is less and less with the lower levels. The difference of maturation between boys and girls. Now, a lot of this has to do with the level that you are teaching, whether you're, if you're fortunate enough to be teaching languages at an elementary school level, because we don't have enough of that, whether we're in middle school, and then we have that challenge, particularly of the 6th grade boys. Bless those teachers who can teach them languages at the same time, our high school kids and our college students. And quite frankly, with my younger college students, my freshmen and my sophomores, I really don't see much difference between them and my juniors and seniors that I used to have in high school. I have another subgroup that sometimes shows a difference. I have students in my college classrooms who have graduated from public high schools, and I often have between a third and a half of the students who've been homeschooled. And that makes a big difference in how they learn. Usually positive, but not always. Sometimes there are age level characteristics associated with the homeschooling that I have to work on in the classroom. Self-absorbed, always on the phone, not if you take the phone away from them and talk to whoever's on the other end, that seems to work. Resistance to foreign language learning, yes. I'm not sure how we solve that, but I think the communicative approach and input that is interesting to them can help. I'm not sure that we really will solve it if they really are doing it because they're being forced to. Instant gratification is the norm. That's true. That's one of the generational characteristics. So I think you have identified a lot of them. One I don't see up here, though, that my students in this room mentioned, and that is the issue of technology. And so many of the students have grown up with technology. Some people call those natives. Those of us in my age category aren't. And when I have older students in the classroom, sometimes graduate students who are making up hours that they need in their languages, they don't really like all of the technology. But that's something we have to take into account because our curriculum, our textbooks, are going more and more to the online format. And a lot of the input that we can give them comes from online formats. And we need to learn how to take advantage of those. I'm in the process of learning a lot of things I didn't think I ever wanted to learn. But I found most of them very effective. Okay, let's go on to the second standard. I ensure that students receive consistent and comprehensible input that is meaning-bearing. And this is probably the core of the 3 standards we have for today. This is all of teaching, but input is evident in T1 and T6 and T8. And again, you're done through some of the standards that are related here. If you're not familiar with WIDA, which is an English second language, it is the organization. It would be kind of like the NCATE or ESL that most states have adopted, and it stands for World Class Instructional Design and Assessment. This document was in the TEL project documents, and I thought it was appropriate to take a look at. These are for you, for us as the teacher. At least 90% of what the teacher says and or materials teacher shares with the students is in the target language. And this can be a hard one for some of our colleagues. It is so easy to revert to English. It's actually just as easy to teach it in the target language. It's a mindset that we have to put ourselves in, that we are going to use the target language in class and figure out a way to be comprehensible in that language with the student. And that's the whole purpose of the input. I minimize my use of English by carefully and deliberately determining when and if I use English in the classroom. I think that standard probably in the use of English is more difficult for our ESL colleagues because English is our language. We are fluent in it. We are proficient in it. And we tend not to focus our input in a way that our non-native speaking students can understand the English. We throw in slang. We throw in idiomatic expressions. Yes, they're all appropriate. Yes, they should hear them. But at what level in their language development should these things be thrown in? You have to be self-monitoring to a little extent or become proficient at immediately circumlocuting with your language so that they can understand that one thing equals another thing. I ensure that my students acquire new vocabulary within a meaningful context and through the use of cultural products and practices. The 5 C's come in here from ACTFL, the products and the practices and the perspectives, and the new vocabulary. Now, a little later on, we'll talk about another approach that is gaining momentum out there, and that's the Common Core, which focuses on literacy and vocabulary. And I think we'll be interested in seeing that our good friend Stephen Creation is not in favor of the Common Core because of several things we'll look at. I use a variety of strategies, meaning visuals, concrete objects. In some areas, those are called manipulatives, hands-on experiences to make language comprehensible. I frequently check for understanding throughout the lesson, so I'm pulling assessment into my input. Just giving input isn't enough if I don't know whether or not it's being effective. I clarify what I say by using a variety of techniques, simplification, restating, adjusting speed, I just mentioned another one, circumlocution. All of these are important strategies that we as teachers must intentionally bring into the classroom. And the third standard, I provide opportunities for students to engage in cultural observation, products, practices, and perspectives, your 5 C's, of both the new and the students' own cultures, which is very important. My input needs to address the culture of the new language, not just the culture of the student's first language. And these are the standards that the TEL documents give you. I'm not sure in what order because I was adding things for my own purposes. Okay, so we come to input as a strategy by itself. And we're going to be talking about input for the rest of the session. So the first thing I would like you to talk about for just a few minutes, 2 or 3, what is input? And we come up with a definition of input. We're going to turn our sound down here for a couple minutes while we talk, and you talk, and then I'll take a look at your Okay, input equals information and how it is conveyed to students. Yes. Any other ideas? Anything that has meaning, absorbing and product information, songs. Yes. Often I hear the definition of input, well, that's vocabulary, and it's always oral. Would you agree with that? No. It is what we teach our students. Yes, input is what we're teaching them. The information we're giving them that we want them to process, and then we want them to use in communication in order to communicate a meaning. Yes, and input is distinct to cultures. Absolutely. Here are some definitions by educators and researchers whose names you may recognize, and they are from a variety of time periods, materials to listen to or read in the target language, from Becoming a Language Teacher by Horowitz, 2008. Material's not too old, but I think that that's a very limited definition of what input is. Gass and Selinker, interesting, the language that is available to learners, that is exposure, is their definition of input. And an interesting book that I check every once in a while to see what the thinking is in this, and I will not attempt the pronunciation of the author's name. Input refers to oral and written data of the target language to which learners are exposed through various sources and recognized by them as useful and usable for language learning purposes. A little bit wordy, but I like that. I think that covers it without having to name every specific kind. We're going to want to name different kinds of input, but I found these three. There are many other definitions. You can go to Creation for definition, but I thought these were different enough that they were worth putting next to each other in the screen to see how wide the definitions may be. Okay, here's another one, and I like this because this one takes our input as a general strategy and focuses it. This is talking about focused input, although it's a very much older definition. When input is simplified and tailored to the level of the learner, learners are able to make connections between form and meaning and thus convert input to intake, where they process it. Intake is language that is comprehended and used by learners to develop a linguistic system that they then use to produce output in the language. And when we look at this definition, then we come to our major proponent of the role of input in language learning. These hypotheses, as Susan Creation, I put them all up here, but highlighted the input hypothesis that humans acquire language in only one way, by understanding messages or receiving comprehensible input. And I have a little formula there. But all of the others are important in input because a student's emotional reaction to what's going on in the classroom will either hinder or help facilitate the input that the student is getting in the classroom. And the natural order hypothesis talks about the stages of language learning, and they are different in different people, but as language acquisition research shows us that there are certain aspects of language which are, as Creation would say, early acquired and some later acquired. And if we are trying to give our students later acquired types of input when they are still in the early acquired age, it's not going to be effective. It's just going to go way over their head, and it won't mean anything to them. Most of you have seen this or a similar representation of his theory of language acquisition. The comprehensible input has to go through that effective filter, as I just mentioned. It is acted upon by the language acquisition device. It becomes acquired knowledge, then it's monitored. The screen went off again.
Just move your mouse. There you go.
Okay. And becomes learned knowledge. Many of our textbooks that we use with our students have criticisms of creation. I've just thrown some of these up here, come from the teacher's handbook that many of us use. His theories have not been empirically tested in language learning environments, and some of us would say, well, so what? We know it works. And whatever works in the classroom is what we're going to use in order to keep our students interested. Concepts such as comprehensible input. And I don't know what's going on here. That's where it is, I think. Present a simplistic view of acquisition process. Use of the acquisition-rich environment diminishes the role of the learner, and other things. I don't think we need to go into those, but I do think as teachers we need to be aware of what some of the criticisms are and think about them. That's all I'm asking. You should be aware of them and that you think about them. And both Chomsky and Creation talked about the acquisition order. I have another little blurb about acquisition, research on the sequence of acquisition of words. So there are now research is beginning to split up what kind of acquisition is there. There's acquisition of word and there's acquisition of pragmatic features in the language. And researchers are looking at both of those, but in both fields we have some consistent patterns that either the words or the pragmatic features are learned, are acquired, let's use them more. Sorry, that comes out of my French class, in a certain order. And we can't rearrange the order, that our brains are hardwired to acquire language in that order. There are some differences in languages, particularly between Eastern languages and some of the Western ones, so you need to check out your own language that you're teaching for that. And I will acknowledge that I use some information from Wikipedia on that. I am not a fanatic against Wikipedia. Tell my students they may use it as long as they are aware of what it is, they document it, and they come up with any questions that they might have on any of the information. Some of you may be interested in the fact that Creation has been weighing in on the Common Core literacy initiatives that we're seeing around the country. And his criticism really falls into the area of the order of acquisition. And he feels that the way vocabulary and literacy is being presented in the Common Core is contradicting the evidence we have as to the stages of acquisition. And that if students are not ready for that stage of acquisition, no matter what my literacy strategy is for reading, that's normally where they're talking about in Common Core, it won't be effective. And he recommends, of course, that the reading be interesting and compelling to the reader. And there's a lot of things out there on the internet that he's had to say lately about this. You may be interested in going out. I think I have some on my reference sheet that you can look at. And this was the last point that he had on that. I've mentioned that input needs to have a purpose. This graphic comes out of the business world, but I think it's applicable to what we're doing. We have inputs. Our students must process that input. It leads to an output, which should lead to assessment, to an outcome. what we want our students to take away. And if I could have come up with a better one with my own drawing, I would have done it, but this was good. Okay, attributes of input. There's always the danger of GIGO, which is garbage in, garbage out. Or, as one of my colleagues likes to talk about, effective and ineffective input. Good input and bad input. All input is not equal. So now I would like you to come up with some thinking on what is ineffective input. And I think we've already talked about several things that might inform your thinking at this particular point. So about 3 minutes, not more, on ineffective input. Good comments. Teacher talks about country of origin all the time. So the input is not authentic to the new language. It may not be relevant or age appropriate. It's not engaging. It may be just couched as vocabulary lists rather than used in context. Good point. Random vocabulary out of context. Yes, this is where the focusing of the input becomes very important, not relevant to the students' lives. The pacing is very important. Inappropriate pacing, yes. The content isn't appropriate, maybe the approach isn't appropriate. It's not relevant to the material being taught. Too many rabbit trails going on. We only have a certain amount of time with those students in a particular class period. We have to make the most of that amount of time, and I will admit to loving to go off on rabbit trails, particularly with my advanced students. Maybe it's more appropriate with that, but it's always a danger. We came up with some in our room here with some comments. Maybe the teacher is not aware of the developmental or learning characteristics of his or her students, and therefore not able to adapt input to that. Maybe above the level the student is able to take in at that particular point. We ventured maybe to mention that if we have heritage learners in the classroom and the teacher's L2 ability is a little shaky, that may be a problem and something that needs to be worked on. All very good comments about inappropriate. And I think we know inappropriate input when we run into it, when we hear it, when we see it. But in addition to that, we have to evaluate the input that we're giving to our students and to see whether or not we are giving inappropriate input. Maybe there's something that gets the point across just as well, but a different way. So what are our types of input then? This receives the most attention. But there's also print text input. And one of the biggest problems I have with my methods students when they're doing a thematic unit is to get them to understand that text does not necessarily mean print on the page, that it may mean text input that is musical. It may be print, but it can be a poem instead of a short story or a lecture. It could be advertisements. It could be many kinds of text that is printed, but it doesn't necessarily mean reading a story, which is what most of my students say. Could be smells, could be tastes, sounds, sensations, even ideas and concepts. Not only at the advanced level, I think some of our lower level learners are capable also of grasping input concepts. And the important thing to note is that all of these relate to the 5 C's area of comparisons and contrast, where students are comparing and contrasting a new language with the one they know, ideas and attitudes with the values that come from their culture and the new culture that they're talking about. And there is just a wealth of information, i.e. input, that the teacher can give to the students at all of those levels. Rationale for the input. With what little, and I know that may be a little politically incorrect, but I mean it, what little they do know of the world around them and what they need to know in order to function in any language. Rationale for the input. With what little, and I know that may be a little politically incorrect, but I mean it, what little they do know of the world around them and what they need to know in order to function in any language. What we need to do with our input is look at the new information, the new material we're going to give them, we're going to call that input. It has to be comprehensible, but it has to relate to what they already know, their background knowledge, their prior knowledge, which can be very broad when we're accessing that because we like to assume that they have broad background knowledge. And then as we start to narrow that down in our discussion or our examples or our visuals, and we finally are able to access the new input, which is very specific, very focused, and in most cases quite small until they have acquired it, they're comfortable with it, and then my input down at the bottom of my funnel has come down here, and we've worked with it, it's processed, and now we can expand that input like these ripples and start applying it to a wider segment of knowledge that they need to know.
So now I'm going to give some examples from my own teaching, and by the visual on the left, you probably will know, some of you, what curriculum I'm using in my classes. That's okay. I happen to love this comic book series anyway. And we talk about obelisks.
And it's early in the text. The purpose is simply to describe this guy. And he is a good candidate for being described because he's fat, he's got red hair, he's got a mustache, he's wearing a belt. So the students at this point, 3 days into class, have access to descriptions of people, to colors, to different clothing, and very little else at this point. They're at the word level in what they're doing. But his name has an importance. And so I often ask them, and usually I do ask them in English because their French is not appropriate at this point to do the whole discussion. What is an obelisk? Right. Do you think there's an obelisk in Lynchburg? Because I want to connect it with what they know. One. Many of our students come to Liberty University and spend 4 years on the mountain and never even go into town. I want them to get off the mountain. I want them to get into town. I want them to learn about the world around them. And so I give an extra credit question. If you can come to class, next class period, with a picture of an obelisk in town, you get 5 points credit. 5 points isn't enough to affect their grade. But they always want extra credit. So some of them, not very many, in a class of 20, I may have 3 the next class period who come in, and they have a picture of this obelisk, which is dedicated in Lynchburg to one of our Civil War local heroes. Students who live in that area also happen to know that because it's at a Y intersection, it gets knocked down all the time by cars that run into it. And so sometimes it's there and sometimes it isn't, depending on whether it's in a state of repair. On the other side is a similar history. Then I can focus on Place de la Concorde when we get to 3 lessons past that, when we're talking about directions in town, and we're looking at the map of Paris, and we're looking at Place de la Concorde, and here we have an obelisk there. So then this is, obelisk is prior knowledge for them. Pardon? What? Yeah. Okay. We have lost some of these, so we'll get you back. Okay? Good. Glad to have you back with us. So when I get to this lesson, 4 lessons past this lesson, now talking about an obelisk is prior knowledge. And I can use that prior knowledge in our discussion of how to get around town. In an upper level class, which I teach on culture and civ, but we're doing French culture through food, cooking. And we use 2 books. One is a book called A Table, which really gives a good, it integrates French history true lives of chefs and through the courts in France. And we used a little French cookbook, locally produced in Virginia, in Campbell County,
which is the early years of colonial America through the cooking of the early trappers and the explorers and Thomas Jefferson and all those kinds of things. And so at one point in the text, a Canadian general is mentioned, and the date, 1742, is mentioned, and he wrote home to his wife. He paraphrases Du Bellai's Mal de Pays poem, when will I ever see my home country again, because he is missing the food from France so much. And so he has a whole paraphrase of that little poem in the that's reprinted in the cookbook. And what I want with these students at this level in the class is to be able to see the connections between what was going on in the history of our country and what was going on in the history of European countries, in England, in Canada,
in France, in other places, because our students don't seem to make those connections on their own. Well, at the end of the year, we do a dinner that they have to prepare using some of the recipes in either of the books. And because I don't have a kitchen in my classroom at Liberty University, we use the kitchen in my husband's church, which is some distance away from the university. And in fact, this church was founded in 1742. Now, it was not built in brick at that time. This is the fourth rendition of the building itself, but it has been continuously a church since 1742. So when we hit that point in the book, I make the connection between where they are doing their dinner, a place they really know, a place where people's feet actually walked in Campbell County in 1742, and this general up in Canada, General Montbaume, was actually complaining about the food he was having to eat. And did you also know that Handel's Messiah was performed for the first time in England in 1742? At which point, two of my students raised their hand and said, what's the Messiah and who is Handel?
And I think headway here in teaching them connections. But they are advanced level French, and so I could explain to them in French the importance of this work, and then suggest that, because this is a spring course, that the next fall course, they make sure they go hear the presentation of the Messiah, either from our university chorale, the Roanoke Chorale, or one of the local churches, so that they will. And I hope if they ever hear, oh, somebody's performing the Messiah again, that will remind them of the studies that we did about cooking and also about the poor quality of French food in Canada at that particular time. But I try to make these connections with my students so that they think outside the box, so they think outside themselves. And I think we can find input that will do that for us. So characteristics of input. Well, we'll start, of course, with meaningful and comprehensible, which means everything below. It's intentional, it's focused, it's authentic, it's contextualized, it's culturally appropriate.
It provides a linguistically rich environment. Some of your textbooks will do an excellent job, particularly if they're newer textbooks, by explaining the approach that they're using and how input is handled in their approach. And one of the explanations that I have seen in some texts is that simply a picture of something, well, it might be interesting because it's different from the picture in the book, but it's the same thing. That doesn't provide them with additional information. But if I'm using a picture that contains that thing, as well as other things that can be related to it, and words which they can access, maybe they would be cognate words, that immediately expands their knowledge. And you can refer back to those things later in their prior knowledge as you're accessing another level. We're constantly needing to deal with a spiral, that we start and we expand it, we come back to it, we expand it, we come back to expand. We can always call a student's attention. Remember when we looked at this. Remember that page that had this on it. Now we're going to go here. To some extent, it needs to be individualized, and for particularly our younger students, and by younger I don't just mean age, but also generational, they are very self-focused, and they like to talk about themselves. And if you can individualize the input that you're giving them, you will have their attention. It should be interactive. TPR comes in here, and you can use TPR at different levels. I hope that your input is integrative, interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary. This is emphasized particularly in the public schools with many of the SOLs, and connecting your input with what's going on in the history class or the English class or the math class. Connected to prior knowledges, not just prior knowledge, but knowledges in their first language, and some of them have more than one first language. So as much as we can connect to all of that, input should support a thematic or a functional approach. You can call that proficiency, you can call it communicative, as long as it is integrated. Now, I was online looking around, and I came across this. Remember that the definition is massive comprehensible input. And this blog is talking about massive input strategy. I've put this URL there, and if you access the PowerPoint later when it's archived online, you can copy it down. And the input, the blog writer, the blogger says, massive input-output is essentially opening the floodgates of a language and letting the information wash over you. It's not studying in the traditional sense. No flashcards, no textbooks, no fancy iPhone apps necessary. Massive input is about increasing exposure to a language during your daily routine and giving you a better feel for that language. Yeah, I think we would agree with that. His blog doesn't italicize this. I did. It doesn't matter if you don't understand everything that you are hearing. The point is that your brain is still subconsciously processing some of the information. My caveat on this would be I'd probably be okay up with it if you're in an immersion setting. Where you're going to be given not comprehensible. At one point, you're going to be coming into contact with over and over and over again, and it will become comprehensible. I think in our classrooms, with the limited amount of time we have with our students, that we need to make it comprehensible. Just letting all the stuff flow over them and say, you're going to get back on an evaluation. I can't understand a word the teacher's ever saying. And he or she never explains anything. And you know we're responsible for those evaluations that come from our students anymore. The only time I do that in my classroom, and I do it intentionally, is at the beginning of the classroom in our classes at Liberty. Many of us open the class with prayer. And I will pray as one prays in French. And I do not translate it. And I start that with the first day of 101. But I tend to use the same types of phrases over and over and over. And I have had at least two instances, one just last week and one last year, when I finished praying towards the end of a semester in 101, and a young lady burst out. I don't think she realized she was talking out loud, but she said in a very loud whisper right in front of me, I understood what she said. And to me, that was very validating. And this week I had another one where the student said, oh, I'm understanding some of your vocabulary now, because I let them give me things that they want to be prayed about first in English. I do it in French. Stop, go on with the class. Don't bother to explain it. That's the only time I do this massive, overwhelming, that they don't understand. And after a while, because it's repetitious, some of them will get it and some of them won't. So, okay, so my question to you is, should it be just massive input or massive comprehensible input? And we'll just take about 2 minutes on that, because I've probably said too much already. Yes, the last comment about discipline issues in the classroom. When students are not understanding, the language might as well not be going on because they are going to find something else to fill that time. Whether it's pulling out a cell phone and using the cell phone under cover of their desktop, whether it's whispering to a neighbor, whether it's doodling in their notebook, they're going to find some way to fill that time, but this is not being profitable time to them. Videos, movies are great, but in the classroom I think we have to use video clips. We have to prepare them for that particular clip. We have to use information in that clip then immediately afterwards in discussion or partner work or pair work. We have to bring maybe some of that input or vocabulary into the class the next day for review and then build on it. We don't have enough time in the classroom to waste time by simply letting them be immersed in the warm bathwater of language. But I will suggest that they go to a country in the summer or over breaks where that can happen, where they really get the feeling of the massive input in its normal setting. And usually that awakes them to the fact that if I don't pay attention to this in class now, I really cannot understand it. And they often come back with a better understanding. I have a young man who went to a Spanish-speaking country, one of my French students, French minor, Spanish-speaking country over break. And when he told me where he was going, I said, why? How is that going to help your French? Well, I want to go with this team trip. Okay. So when he came back, and he's probably at that point one of my lower level students on communicative ability. He came back, and the first day after spring break, he was chattering away in French. I mean, he was chattering in French, not just waiting till I'd ask a question and give the answer, to a young lady who is bilingual speaker of French. Went on. So I decided to find out what was going on by asking him in French to give a report about his spring break. I went around the whole class. Everybody had to do it. Before break, he would have given me 2 sentences. After break, I couldn't stop him from speaking French. But he'd been in a Spanish-speaking country. I said, what on earth happened? I asked him in French. He said, well, one of the things we were required to do while we were there was learn some Arabic. Not Spanish, but Arabic, because where we went, there were a lot of Arab-speaking people. So our teacher for Arabic was a native speaker of both French and Arabic. And so outside of class, he and I would talk in French a lot. And he had a lot of friends who spoke French. So even though I was in Spain, I was getting to use my French all the time. And even now, a month after spring break, he doesn't want to speak English anymore in class. He wants to use French because he was in a situation where he had input in French all the time. He didn't understand it, but it meant something to him, and he tried to improve his language. And I think that's what we want with our students. I don't want perfection. I don't want everything right, but I want them to use it. So we're continuing and shortly finished with characteristics. It should be accessible to their level of language. It should be taking into account the levels of language immersion. In the natural approach, you have comprehension, you have early language and language immersion. We need to pay attention to, in world languages other than English, the proficiency levels from ACTO, in English itself, the WIDA levels, and I've given you internet URL here if you're interested in finding out what those levels are. Many of my student teachers in Spanish, in their student teaching positions, end up working with English learners as well as the Spanish students in their class. So I think it's important to bridge 2 of those areas. You need to assess the learning styles, just a review of the learning styles. You need to assess the Gardner's multiple intelligences in your input, just a different representation of these. And interesting, Gardner's multiple intelligences keep increasing. I think there are 9 of them now. Originally there were 6 or 7, so we're
becoming smarter. We need to understand Bloom's taxonomy for higher level thinking, and most of you are aware of the fact that the Bloom's taxonomy has been updated in the last couple of years, and so we have a change at the top, the higher level thinking orders.
At the bottom, there are a few changes, some comprehension, understanding, I would say basically the same thing, different way of saying this, analyzing, analysis, knowledge and remembering. I think that's a significant change at the bottom, knowledge and remembering. But the new Bloom's comes from 2009. And then I think, personally, I want some of the input to be serendipitous. By that, I do not mean it's off the cuff. I don't mean you're winging it. In one of my lessons in intermediate level in French, the chapter in the textbook was talking about environmental issues and environmentalism. And that morning, when I got up and turned on British broadcasting, which is what I listen to in the morning, they were talking about the fact that the mayor of Paris had brought in French sheep to mow the grass in the parks in Paris because it was less expensive and more environmentally friendly. So I went to the internet and I took a picture from the French news of this traditional French sheep that they say is absolutely no good for wool, and it was disappearing because it's not good for wool, and the meat isn't very good either. So I just put it up there, and we were discussing, and we had learned the vocabulary term, mow the grass, and so I could use those terms without putting any language on there to begin with my students, environmental problems, and we had done some writing about which do you think is the most serious environmental problem, how would you solve it, and so we could talk then about how does this sheep solve an environmental problem in Paris. And the students loved it. So these things that come up spontaneously that you can bring in the classroom because you know they're appropriate, they're focused on what you're doing, they can apply what they've learned to something a little bit bigger, and then at some point we can go on to something else. So I credit that to one of my graduate professors who said, every lesson should have something serendipitous in it. And I've already mentioned the stages of language immersion. So a few characteristics here. The early stage, this doesn't last very long. Students are quickly into speech because why are they taking the language? They want to speak the language. I asked my students to write me in English the first day of class. Why did you sign up for this class? Be honest. Do you have to take it? Because they said so for your major. Do you want to learn something in French? Did your mom say you had to? I don't care. It's not going to count against you. Tell me why you're in this class. And they're usually pretty honest. But one thing I get almost all the time, and I've kept these little sheets for years, I want to learn to speak the language. I want to learn to speak the language. That's what they want out of the class. So they quickly use these things that they take in, they acquire, and go to this point very quickly, and even to this point very quickly. And we need to accommodate their desire to do that with our input. Just a review of the actual proficiency levels. We need to know what
the characteristics of the WIDA, the ESL proficiency levels, are described this way, and you can get a narrative description of those at that particular URL.
And now our strategies. For stages 1 and 2, comprehension and early speech, everything needs to be focused and intentional and controlled. It needs to be planned, and it needs to be student-centered. It needs to be interesting to them. And I'm going to come back to that one with an example. So in comprehension, you can use these. Now, I think that all of these can be used at any level, but you're going to have to adapt them. But some of your textbooks will say this is what you should do at stage 1. I like to come back. I use this one at all levels. And you can use the same activity, but change it for the language level and for the age level. For example, here's one that comes out of my textbook. It's not in English, it's in French. We just did this. Your conduct at the wheel. It was a chapter about transportation, getting around the town. Who in the class always stops at a red light? This was all in French. And I have native speakers in that class who slipped in, not unintentionally on my part, but they slipped in intentionally to get a good grade. They're a bunch of Haitian students. And we, unfortunately, don't have a way of preventing that. They love this because they wanted to go around and tell in French all of their classmates what they do and don't do in driving. So who always stops at a red light, who drives too fast, runs red light. You can do this from early lessons and find out about student characteristics, find out about their families, find out about all kinds of student information. I have this on a little half sheet that they fill out. They give it to me and they get 2 or 3 points for having done it in class. But I keep those. And then I can recycle this student information later when something else comes up. Sometimes I even recycle them 1 semester or 1 year to the next. And I pull it out and then, oh, you still have that. And I said, Stéphanie aime bien conduire trop vite. Oui, c'est vrai, Stéphanie. And so we come back into it. So now it's old stuff for them. It's prior information, and we apply it to something new. And they love to find out who's going to sign their list here for doing these kinds of things. For middle school students, of course, they wouldn't be driving, but there are bicycle rules that they can be, do they wear their helmets when they bicycle? Do they wear appropriate clothing? Do they ride their bikes with flip-flops? Who does this? And then in your upper level classes, you can talk about, okay, we had all these examples of inappropriate driving. Are these rules or are they laws? And we can get into a discussion between the difference between a rule and a law. And, do you think they ought to be laws? Why? Hypothetical situations, and support your opinion. Speech emergence, single words and short phrases. This is where they can answer just yes or no, or either or questions, or repeat what you have said in their answer, and eventually get to open sentences. I've got lists of words in here. There are times when I simply have to say, you've got to memorize this list, because they're showing me that they haven't been doing their homework, they haven't been doing the exercises, they're failing quizzes, and so I have to revert back to a different way of doing it. I think anything is going to work. I love dictation. Students hate them. Dictation, how they integrate rules. I don't use them very often, but I do occasionally just to find out where my students are. In stage 2, many different kinds of dialogues modeled by the professor or by 2 students in class, and then more open creative language. The modeled dialogues are rather closed. They're focused. They use a small set of vocabulary, specified idiomatic expressions. The open dialogues are more free-flowing. Interviews. The difference between the model interview and the open one is the model interview is more interviewing for purposes of a survey or something like that, where you're looking for specific information, whereas an open interview is more a real interview, where the other person doesn't know what question's going to be coming up, and you have to think in real-life situations. Questions based on charts or drawings, not just questions, but a whole discussion based on that. And in stage 2, you should be doing things in logical order, not just random all over the place. In stage 3, you really want to be using discussions and the open interviews. Storyboards are great. The latest issue of the ACTFL Journal has an article on technology in it, and it recommends a couple of online digital storyboarding software that's very simple that can be used. I like to use Audacity, which is an online free recorder with my students to get information that I may not be able to get, particularly on pronunciation, in class, but you can add that to your storyboards, and then it
can be a presentation. There are more students where they have a problem to solve, or they have a suggestion to make. They have a situation that they need to discuss, and they need to sort out particulars of the situation. They may need to solve the problem. They may need to make suggestions. They may need to change the ending. But it's very open and free-flowing and therefore creative. Sometimes my students, okay, you have this handout. I hope that your site host has the handout. I have put down here several strategies, but I have not categorized them as far as stages. What I would like would be to take about 5 minutes. I think we have enough time, and we're almost at the end here. And see if we can put these in. Should this be a stage 1? Should it be a stage 2? Should it be a stage 3? Should it be all 3 stages? Could it be with adaptation? Are there any others that should be up here? And maybe these will give you some ideas about what you can do with your own classes. So can we take the sound off that for a minute?
We had a good discussion about where we would put some of these and how these could cross over from one level to another, one stage to another. I'm sure you can come up with many more, but this might give you some ideas that you can look back at later and see how you can use them in your classroom. Now, all that we've been talking about in input, all of the strategies, we can go online and we can find strategies, we can find books of strategies. In my sources and resources page, if you look at that, you will see that several of the things I put there are ESL sources. I am very partial to the materials that are being used in ESL. I think they are very, very good. I don't always approve of the approach in the classroom that's being used. I do think sometimes there's still too much of the traditional reading, translation, that type of an approach. But the materials are out there that can be easily adapted to world languages. I saw some wonderful ones in a classroom this morning when I was observing a student teacher. But it all boils down to teacher responsibility. And I don't want to be the teacher putting the garbage in that is exploding the student's brains afterwards. So what is my responsibility? And here, everything we know, but we need to rethink every once in a while. What do we need to know in the academic area? And I'm going to go through quickly all of this because you know it. But when we're in the classroom, sometimes we don't think about it. We need to know our languages. We need to be competent in our L2 or more than one. And if we aren't, we need to acknowledge that and take the steps necessary to fix that. You need to know linguistics. I know it's a bad word, but you need to know how languages work, and particularly the one that you're working with. How does the grammar work? I learned in my student teaching many, many years ago, an interesting situation that I started my student teaching, and 2 days after I began the student teaching in a high school, and I graduated from college very young. These kids were a year younger than I was. And so in my senior year, it was like I was working with my own classmates. And on the third day of my student teaching, the co-op teacher didn't show up. And he didn't show up the fourth day. And he didn't show up the fifth day. He never showed up again. He went off on a drunk somewhere, and they never saw him again. So I taught the class for the rest of the student teaching. I think it was 9 weeks. And I learned that I had about 10 seconds from the time the student asked me a question to slowly turn around, pick up the chalk at that time, raise my hand to the chalkboard, and by the time the chalk hit the board, I needed to have an answer to that question. And at that point, I didn't have all the answers from linguistics and from language and grammar and literature and all that. But I learned that I needed to have some answer in 10 seconds. So if we know our background information, we won't have that dilemma. You need to know the literature of English and of your L2. You need to know that little site. We need to know the history, our country, the L2's history. That's why I'm doing what I'm doing in the Culture Through Food class. We need to know pedagogy K through 12, not just K through 16, excuse me, not just learners as well as the young learners. The pedagogy, understanding the curricular approach of your school's adopted curriculum. You often don't have any input into that. So you have to take what you're given and know how you can adapt it to be communicative, proficiency approach, natural approach, whatever you want to call it. How you can use what you're given in order to achieve the outcomes that you need in your language classes. You need to know about lesson planning. You need to know how a lesson flows. You need to know applied language acquisition theory. PSYOP is being used as a co-teaching technique in the schools. Many public school teachers are being asked to do PSYOP training with the ESL teachers. It comes out of special ed, actually. It stands for Sheltered Instructional Operational Protocol. But what it really does is give two outcomes. It gives a content outcome and a language outcome. And the teachers work together on that. And the example that I like to use is in a biology class. The biology class may be wanting to compare, virtually now, cutting up a frog and cutting up a pig. And the students do this with their notebooks. We used to actually do it in class. And they need to look at the nerve system or the optic system and make comparisons. Okay, the comparison is a language issue. How do you compare things in English? How do you compare them in French? How do you compare them in Spanish? What is the vocabulary or the structure that pushes comparison? And so you have not only your content
objective that supports that content. And I gave you a website here where you can look up more of that if you're interested in it. Center for Applied Linguistics kind of specializes in PSYOP
training. I've been up there for conferences. They're very, very good. And then you need to know your alignments. And the more fences you cross or straddle, the more standards you need to know. And so I need to work with all of these. You may not need to work with that many in your situation, but I think it's valuable to know where they're coming from. This is the technology standard, the ISTU standards. And you need to integrate your language with what's going on in the other SOLs. And on the Virginia Department of Education website, there's this very good initiative for integrating the languages with history. And they give you some examples here. So with my student teachers in my methods and materials class, before they get into student teaching, their thematic unit that is required to take a standard SOL and integrate the language into that. And so that they have a teaching unit that they can go out with all the worksheets, the tests, the answers, everything. But it cannot be teaching prepositions in English, teaching subjunctive in Spanish. It's got to be a theme. It has to connect with an SOL, and it has to be story-based. It has to have text. This is my advice to my licensure candidates. This is a big task. This is what you need to become. I don't expect you to be this now, but you need to be reflectively thinking about becoming this kind of a teacher. And this will give you access to input for your own classes. Our personal, I've done this many times on the bus to work. What on earth am I going to do with this class today? I can't stand this class. It didn't do its work last time. I can't do what I had planned to do because they didn't do their work. This becomes the more responsibilities we take on, or the more responsibilities which are imposed on us, the easier it gets to do this. And we need to learn to say no. I don't say it often enough. And we need to think about what we're doing. I've really come to the conclusion that teaching is not the 12 months in the classroom and 2 months vacation, but it's 2 months revising and reflecting and 10 months field testing what I did during those 2 months. And probably going back the next 2 months in the summer and revising and reflecting again to change for the next academic year. So we need to preview and prepare. We need to know our entire curriculum. If you're teaching 2 or 3 levels in the same curriculum, you need to know that curriculum inside and out. You need to know where background and previous knowledge can be accessed in this class because they already had it in the previous area, even if I don't teach that class right now. Or you need to know where my lower level information is going eventually in that curriculum and keep steering the students in that direction. And then when you know your curriculum, these things will just fall into place naturally. This is what I meant to take a picture of my real office, which even looks worse than this, and you can ask one of my colleagues who called it a dump yesterday. He said, when are you going to clean up this dump? And he's right. But this is of no use to us. We need to be organized. We can't find our pictures. I know I have a wonderful picture for that.
I have no idea where it is anymore. It's somewhere in that pile. It's about right here, I know. But if I try to pull it out, all of this is going to fall down on top of it. So we need to plan and organize. I'm talking to myself here. I think my department chair is watching this session, and he will agree. This is an assignment I give to my method students, my trash to treasure assignment, because I love junk. You just saw that office there. Anything that they can come up with in a box, they have to use it in their thematic unit. They have to use it in their student teaching. They have to present it and tell me how they're going to use it. It's just thinking differently about things that come through the mail. One student said last year, Dr. Hahnlen, I can't believe it. My roommate was throwing things out, and I saw her basket, and I said, oh, no, wait, I can use that. And I took stuff out of her trash. And I said, yes, that's exactly what I want you to do. So what happens if we don't do these? I know. I've experienced these moments. We lose the teaching moments. We lose our enthusiasm and the students' interest, and we defraud our students. And we don't want to do that. So be involved, be advocates for all language opportunities, and look for ways to connect your students with language opportunities and with multicultural events. And so now we've looked at the students, we've looked at us, and now what about our administrations? Some of us are administrators. Some of you are administrators. Sometimes we need to teach our administrators and be advocates for our profession. They need to understand that we do need to reflect. In our assessment a year ago of our department and our minors, I had put as one of the outcomes something about reflection. And I was told that couldn't be an outcome because it wasn't testable. I said, I don't care whether you think it's testable or not. That comes in our standards for our profession. That's wording in our standards. I expect my students to do this because they are responsible to the profession, the standards of their profession. And then I had to go before a committee and present reflection as a valid assessment outcome and justify why I put that as an outcome in a graduate course. And the final reaction was, well, that's an education thing, so I guess we'll just have to accept it. It's very important. You can't prepare until you've reflected. You can't revise until you've done these two. You can't develop a curriculum if you don't have this foundation. Then you can be creative, you can collaborate, you can do professional development. But it's all based on that. So we need to be advocates for our profession, get involved, and get our administrators, bring them into the classroom. Give them responsibilities to help you with something. Have them look at things with you. Have them watch certain things that you do and why you do it. They're very teachable, but we need to do that. And that is the end of our session today. I hope that you found some valuable information in it. There is a resource and source sheet that if your host has not given you, it's there somewhere, or you can download it from online. I'm sure you got the email with those on there. So thank you very much. Appreciate your time. If there are any questions you have, feel free to just send me an email. I'll be happy to answer. Thank you. And now what am I
Thank you very much, Dr. Hahnlen. We appreciate everything that you contributed to us this afternoon. And we look forward to seeing this on YouTube, maybe in about 2 weeks' time. Okay. And you'll be distributed around the world, which is even more exciting. And it's time now also to start thinking about topics that you'd like to have for next year. If you have any ideas concerning desires, giving to tell, project itself, please shoot those ideas to me, any concerns that you might have. And if you haven't yet done the survey, we do ask that you do the survey, which is online. You can go to the Virginia Department of Education site and find the information there. Thank you very much for participating with us this year. This concludes our series for this academic year, and we will see you in September. Thanks. Bye-bye. Il n'y a pas de quoi.
Yeah, we're just. Oh, God. Thank you. You're welcome. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. It was very informative.
Good.